they've actually made a decision, Doug, so I've read about this, that his team has decided that they're only aiming at like 11% of the electorate. It's young men of all colors, but young men. Like literally like 35 and under, or 30 or under, something like that. So it's an extremely narrow demographic that they are putting all of their emphasis on in order to win the swing states through that specific targeted demographic. So black, white, Latino men, Asian men, young men, 18 to 30. And once you realize that, then it makes sense why they prioritize some things over other things.
Well, welcome to the Cutrone Zone. Again with me today is the last Marxist, everyone's favorite track coach, genius, Chris Cutrone. Today I asked Chris to go over a clip from a presentation he gave, it was 2017? 18? And he was glad to do so. It was about Marxism and philosophy. And before we start recording, I showed him the clip, but I will insert the clip here.
Postmodernism was, as Washington put it, premature post-capitalism. It aimed at the freeing of the smallest subjects from the biggest subject. It also aimed at freedom from capital H history. It meant overcoming Hegel's philosophy of history. We already live in such freedom in bourgeois society, however, perverted by capitalism. Diverse activities already inhabit different realms of being and call forth different kinds of ethical judgments. Different activities, different forms of being, different ethical judgments. Doctors and lawyers practice activities that define being, that define the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in different ways. They really do. And are hence ethically bound in different ways. Doctors discipline themselves ethically differently from scientists. Among scientists, biology has a different epistemology from physics. There are different methods because there are different objects. There is no philosophy in the sense of a metaphysical logic that encompasses them all. Lawyers, for example, themselves practice differential ethics. Prosecutors and defense attorneys in criminal law are bound by different rules of behavior. The practice of civil law is ethically distinct from criminal law. The rules of evidence are different. The rules of truth are different. Really different. Consequentially different. We do not seek to bind society to one form of knowledge, one code of conduct, one way of life. There is no philosophy that could or should encompass them all. It would be arrogant to claim that there is one singular logic that can be mastered by anyone for governing everything. Bourgeois society has already established well the reasonable limits to philosophy and its competence. In ancient civilization, there were different differentiated realms of being, knowing, and acting. There was a caste system, in which there were different laws for peasants, for merchants, for artisans, and for different kinds of artisans, for different arts and different sciences, and for the nobility and for the clergy. But they were unified in a divine order of the great chain of being. There was heterogeneity, but all with a single origin in God, all of God's creatures and all of God's creation. That mystery was to remain unknown to man and known only to God. There was a reason for everything, but only God could know it. There was not philosophy, but theology. And theology was not to arrogate to itself the place of the mind of God, but only ponder man's place in and relationship to it. Theology established the limits to man's knowledge of God. We knew only what God revealed to us through his covenant. We all heard the word of God, but God told his different creatures different things. In overcoming theology, philosophy did not seek to replace it. It sought to explore the mind of man, not to relate to and limit itself with respect to the mind of God. It was not concerned with divine or natural limits, but with freedom. There is no possible one single and once and for all account of freedom, for then freedom would not be free. There is no possible account of being free but only of becoming free. And there is only one such account, that of bourgeois emancipation from traditional civilization. It was to set free all the diverse and multiple activities of mankind in relation to other humans, to nature, and to ourselves. Marx was both a Hegelian and departed from Hegel, with a historical and not a philosophical difference. As Marx put it, for Hegel himself, the Hegelian system was not ready-made and finished as it was for those who came after. As Marx observed, Hegelianism went into crisis for real historical reasons, not due to misunderstanding by his followers, but rather the crisis came from Hegelian philosophy's actual contact with the world, and that world had become as internally contradictory in capitalism as Hegelianism became in contact with it. The Hegelian dialectic is both appropriate and inappropriate to the problem of capitalism. The crisis and disintegration of Hegelianism was a crisis of metaphysics, of philosophy, at a higher and deeper, and not a lower or more superficial level from Hegelianism. Hegelianism was falsified not in itself, but by history. But Hegelianism was also borne out by history as the last word in philosophy, the last word in metaphysics. Marxism cannot be purged of its Hegelianism without becoming incoherent. Marxism remains Hegelian, albeit with what Lukács called an additional twist of the pure historicization of the dialectic. If society and capitalism remains bourgeois in its ideals, with the goal of providing opportunities for social labor, materially it has become its opposite. As a capitalist, it prioritizes not labor but capital, and at the expense of labor.
And so everyone else can see it. Yeah, I'll do that. And so, Chris, here's my... you said when I showed you this clip that this was a hard one, which to me demonstrated that you had some confidence in your position. And I have an objection to it. And I think my objection is a Marxist one, but maybe it's not. But here's my objection. While it's true that at the level of law or of culture or of lifestyle, we have a plurality of forms of knowledge, ultimately, there's a form of knowledge that, and also by extension, a way of being that does dictate what is right and wrong to us and does ultimately shape what forms of life are acceptable. And that takes place on the level of what I would call the economy. That and it takes place particularly through the working class as the form of their freedom. So labor power and labor time dictate to all of us how we're to live our lives. That's why the working class is the revolutionary class, is because they have stepped in to give us forms of knowledge and forms of social participation and cooperation after the death of God, after the divine right of kings or the holy word has lost its efficacy. And it's a very compelling way of being. It operates behind your back. It is taken, it's reified quite naturally. It reifies itself. We don't have to go through the trouble of ideologically reifying it. It just is reified. So it seems to me that the task for self-conscious Marxists and socialists would be to be able to not embrace a plurality of ways of being, but expose the unitary way of being that we're currently living under, and be able to replace it, not merely to abolish it, but I happen to feel, and this is maybe where we'll have some disagreement that might be productive, that we need, for social participation and cooperation, we need a common mode of life. That we're going to have to discover some other basis for social production and reproduction and collective work. So that's my objection to what you said. What do you think of it?
Okay, so I I should say that this presentation that you excerpted is also written up and published, and it's in the book. It's in Marxism and Politics. It's under the title Ends of Philosophy. And two members of Platypus, Jensen Souther and Teo Velisaris, took issue with it and wrote a critique of it, and then I wrote a rejoinder to it that's also in the book. But I feel like what you're asking now, I want to preface with other essays in the book, namely Capital and History, Capital and History, and also my writings on Lukács and Karl Korsch. So, but on the Capital and History point, and that segment that you just took from my presentation is about my kind of critical dialogue with Moishe Postone on this point. So one way that Moishe would articulate this is to say that for Marx, Hegel's Geist is capital. I always thought this was a kind of a one-sided thing. So he thought, okay, so rather than realizing the capital as subject of the proletariat, in Lukács's terms, identical subject-object of history, the point was to actually abolish the capital S subject and to allow for the freedom of the small s subjects. Now, for me, that's a kind of a paradoxical proposition because it makes the model of freedom after capitalism what existed before capitalism, or really before bourgeois society. And that's why I brought up Capital and History, that the purpose of that essay, which was actually written for a conference that Platypus hosted for the Marxist humanists when they broke away from News and Letters, the Hegelian Marxists. So my intervention with them was that they really didn't properly understand the relationship between Marx and Hegel. And they kind of conflated them in a way that's actually typical for the left. So what's typical for the left, in my mind, and it's something that you see with Stalinism, is the identification and conflation and loss of the contradiction between the bourgeois revolution and the proletarian socialist revolution. So the bourgeois democratic revolution and the proletarian socialist revolution. So just in very simple terms, the struggle for socialism is always going to appear as a continuation of the bourgeois democratic revolution and is going to recapitulate bourgeois radicalism, Jacobinism, etc. But the danger there is that actually that's, and this is where I agree with Moishe, the danger there is that it turns revolution into an engine of capitalism continuing rather than overcoming it. So it's really the relationship between the bourgeois democratic revolution and the dictatorship of the proletariat. There's a contradiction there. There is a contradiction there, and this is why Marxism and Leninism in particular are seen as undemocratic, right? So people do key into this. Whereas my point would be, and again, this is a kind of a tricky point rhetorically, is that, you know, Marxists say, well, capitalism is not really democratic, right? Bourgeois democracy is a sham, liberal democracy is a lie, etc., etc. So can we hold two thoughts at once, which is that it's both true and false, that we are continuing the bourgeois revolution and we're experiencing its contradiction and the need to get beyond the bourgeois revolution. So what you just articulated about labor as freedom, that's the Hegelian view, and that's the socialist view. That's the proletarian socialist view. But that is the bourgeois view, meaning labor as freedom, the power of the emancipatory potential of unleashing labor, not just individual labor, but collective labor, social cooperation, that gave us bourgeois society, ultimately leading into capitalism, but it gave us bourgeois freedom. And capitalism contradicts that freedom, and so we seek to restore that freedom. And then we look back and we say, well, the bourgeois revolution wasn't really freedom, it's just freedom for the bourgeoisie, and that's a very tricky term because, of course, the workers were part of the bourgeoisie. right? They weren't the peasants, they weren't the nobles, they weren't the clergy. They are a bourgeois class. The working class is a bourgeois class. Selling your labor as a commodity or your labor power, but that gets into some more tricky stuff. The fungibility of labor, the open-ended character of that, the fact that we're still discovering new forms of social intercourse through our labor, through our collective labor, we're still doing that. So in many respects, what this suggests is that the bourgeois revolution is unfinished and maybe will never be finished. It has a kind of permanently incomplete character. The problem is that actually, for Marx and for Marxism, the industrial forces of production have outstripped the social relations of labor. In other words, has given us the possibility of a freedom beyond labor. And by the way, another essay in my book, Beyond History, and also yet another, The Self-Overcoming of Labor Beyond Capitalism, where I talk about, again, Moish. So my critical dialogue with Moish is very important. So the point being that Hegel's Geist, which is the activity of labor, I was just going over in Platypus the master-slave dialectic and how everyone leaves out labor and turns it into the battle to the death of the master and slave, and it's like, yeah, that's not the point. The point is that that's not consciousness. If it's a battle to the death, it's not consciousness. It's only when it becomes the slave's labor recognizing itself, that's the beginning of consciousness, right? So it's really an account of labor. Again, the problem is that we already have a potential beyond that, and that this society, all the inhumanity of this society, is actually a perverse expression of a possibility beyond the freedom of labor, right? So that negativity is actually suggests a freedom beyond what we have achieved so far historically, the freedom of labor. So it's both. Hegelian Geist is labor and it's capital. It's both. And that contradiction is really important to understand. Right? So it's not one or the other. Right? So Moish had this kind of one-sided dismissal of traditional Marxism. Oh, well, traditional Marxism is just pro-capitalist because it's about constituting the proletariat and calling that freedom. But really, that's the constitution of unfreedom. And it's like, it's both. And it remains both. It's not like there's a discrete moment in time in which freedom becomes unfreedom. It does, but it remains freedom too. Right?
Yeah.
The Hegelian notion of contradiction is that it emerges, meaning it's not simply there to begin with, it emerges, it's an emergent property, and then it points beyond itself, but in a double-sided way, not in a one-sided way. It's not like we throw in with the industrial forces of production, like fully automated luxury, gay space communism or whatever, nor is it anarcho-primitivism. And I write about that in the book as well, but it must necessarily, the struggle for socialism must necessarily look like unlimited growth and degrowth, Luddism and techno-futurism. It's always going to look like both. That's why this is so difficult. Why overcoming capitalism is so difficult, because it's both. It's going to appear as both. That's why we need the Hegelian dialectic, all this madness. Why it's not a straightforward proposition. So anyway, that's just to give you an entry into like what I was trying to address there, and really the question of philosophy, like capital P philosophy. Maybe capital P philosophy was emancipatory, but maybe the postmodernists are right that actually freedom now demands the dissolution of capital P philosophy into philosophies, right? And by the way, Hegel already anticipated that. He said that he finished philosophy, and now the philosophical spirit would permeate all the different activities in society and diversify itself, right? It wouldn't be, like, in other words, he completed the metaphysics of freedom so that we could get beyond it.
Well, okay. I don't really disagree with much of what you said, but I feel like my objection hasn't been addressed.
Probably not.
Right. Yeah, right. And here's why. And see if this will help clarify it. Adorno has a critique of culture, of something about like how Bach is become the equivalent to bikinis, something along those lines. Like there's been a flattening out of what we'll call use values or just everyday culture. And because everything is reduced down to a quantitative quality, in its exchangeability, right? And so
super tricky as a thought figure, because of course part of what he means by that, in terms of time, labor time, is that everything becomes a pastime.
Oh yeah, that's a kind of punny way of saying it, right? Because everything's dead labor.
Yep.
And everything is a hobby or a pastime, or both at the same time.
And a kind of killing time. Why do we listen to music? To kill time. We kind of do everything. It's kind of like, what are we going to do tonight? Oh, we'll go to the theater. Everything is a time-killing activity, including labor itself. Right?
Yeah. Because by killing time through labor, you're creating something of value. Other pastimes don't create.
And you're realizing value in consumption. Never forget that it's production and consumption, meaning value is realized in consumption. And the consumption is, of course, the reproduction of labor power itself, the reproduction of the working class itself, meaning we need to survive.
Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. There's MCM and there's CMC, and workers do CMC and capitalists do MCM.
Well, and that means that both are happening.
True. But I'm just saying, like, when I consume...
It's always both. It used to be CMC, now it's MCM prime and CMC. It's both.
Yes, it's both. But all I'm saying is that when a worker goes to McDonald's, that may help him go to work the next day and do...
But it valorizes capital. And that's the more important thing. In terms of the history of social development, the valorization process of capital overrules, but doesn't eliminate.
Look, I'm thinking. I feel like we're opening up a different conversation about.
But it's related. It's to my dialectical point. It's not one or the other. It's both. And I think the problem is we're dealing with 100 years of Marxism in which people are like, no, it's one and not the other, and then other people are like, no, it's the other and not this, and it's like, actually, it's both.
Right, but when we're talking about producing value, while it's true that you realize, and valorize capital through consumption, it isn't the case that workers' wages and workers' private consumption is what is ultimately the foundation.
Out, why are people watching this video? Why is this video on YouTube? Why does YouTube exist?
Oh, to kill time.
Well, that, but also, why does YouTube exist? Why is capital invested? Because they're developing algorithms based on viewing habits, meaning we are the viewers of the product. In other words, we're not producing the product. The product is the data for the algorithms of the viewers. That's what's really being produced. That's what they sell to other companies. That's the commodity, right? And so the only reason that this exists is because someone has figured out that there's this use value, namely algorithmic data, that can be captured through consumption of this kind of material. Like, otherwise we might think that the video itself, that me talking now, is the commodity. Actually, it isn't.
That's right. I agree with you completely. Yeah.
So you see how that messes with the clean distinction of these things? Because it always flips. This concretely shows how it flips, but it always flips.
Right, but I don't disagree with that either. That there's that it flips, but I do think that it's important to not be an underconsumptionist when it comes to.
Oh, absolutely, that's very important. And of course, do you remember back in the day, Doug? Since we're old.
Yeah.
That you could get paid for putting a device in the trunk of your car to collect data.
Oh, kind of.
90s. It's sort of on the threshold of the internet.
Yeah. Who was paying you for that? Who would pay you for that again? I don't recall that.
It was like a data research company. So basically, you put something in your car, and it was basically like traffic patterns, driving habits. It was that kind of thing. And basically, you turn in the device would sort of write it all to a hard drive. And then you turn the device on a weekly or monthly basis, and you'd be paid some amount of money. Meaning you get paid for the time stuck in traffic on your commute, which is nice, right?
Yeah.
So now we have that, which is that our leisure time, except we're not being paid for it, but somebody's valorizing capital off of it. Our leisure time is now a source of, capital accumulation, not just our labor time, but our leisure time too. But if you think about it, that's always been the case. That's always been the case. It's not just because of these technical developments that's the case, meaning Marx was on the trail of this. Otherwise, we're going to, there are a lot of people out there, Doug, who are like, what the hell are you guys talking about Marxism? Marxism stuck in like the 19th century, and now, right? It's not these physical commodities, blah blah blah. It's not like physical labor. It's data. It's the information economy. It's this and that. And people have been saying that for like 50 years since the cybernetic revolution. And actually, Marx was talking about this. In fact,
right? Yeah. Well, okay. Let's stay with this for a moment longer, because the way I would understand this is that the data is a use value, which it probably is not, the value of it isn't actually determined by the labor time put into it. It's not a commodity produced by labor, but rather it is a part of the process that basically it's something you can create to help companies valorize the commodities they produce that are an expression of
there's a problem here, though, because labor time is just the first moment, meaning the time of like human labor and production. The reason I brought up consumption is that, I always like to use this as an example when I'm teaching. So I'm an adjunct faculty, and I make a decent income, but really like a worker's wage. So what determines what they pay adjunct faculty? Basically, they have to pay me enough so that I don't take another job instead.
Right.
So that's based on a subsistence level.
And that's determined by the labor market too.
Yeah.
And right now you're really screwed on that level, because
absolutely
for you to take, you could take another job, but it might be, flipping burgers at McDonald's.
Absolutely.
Right. And so they're like, they know you probably won't do that because you enjoy this a bit more than you
take advantage of it at a number of levels. Right. And so all that I'm saying is that even decently paid professionals are being remunerated for their time on the basis of subsistence. It is conditioning the whole thing.
Yeah, I agree with this. And you can see this, basically the rule is if they're paying you more than they can make off you, then you're probably misunderstanding how much they make off you. That otherwise they would, right? Yeah.
Well, like sports stars for commercial professional leagues, even when they're paid millions of dollars, they're still exploited.
Yeah, right. I mean, kind of. Yeah.
No, they really are. They really are. And they should be paid that much because they break their bodies in 10 years. Right?
Yeah, this is a side issue where I try to distinguish.
People get into this stuff, and it's all that I'm saying is there's no point in disputing these things, right? In other words, it's just not about that. At this point, it's about how the value in the system, the gigaflops of data, the money economy at a global scale, has anything to do with the human race and its activities, because it's a very, very highly mediated and abstract relationship at this point. After all these decades of capitalism, it's become this crazy thing. Yet it still does have something to do with it, but only in terms of a long-term historical dynamic, not a day-to-day temporality. That's not the way to understand it. Of course, as humans, we're concerned about our food, clothing, and shelter on a day-to-day basis, but capital is not about that. Capital is about
capital will continue as long as the human race can be reproduced through it.
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
And so
I mean, unless we get beyond
it.
Unless
we change it. But it's not like there's going to be any objective limit. As long as humans' survival can be in some way facilitated by it, it will continue. And so we're talking about historical temporality. And that's where Moish comes in again, because Moish is like the micro and the macro are related, but they're mediated. And really the issue, the unfreedom of capitalism is more a historical proposition than it is a day-to-day. Like, the discontented people were just like, fuck the system, I wish I didn't have to work. Like Unabomber type shit. Like, I wish I could go off and, fall off the grid or something. That is just not the problem.
Right.
The
I agree.
Is long-term history, meaning capital is constraining us, yes, on a day-to-day basis, of course. But really, it's constraining humanity at a historical macro level. That's the real issue, from which flows these other things, right? It's not like, oh, you can like just look at how your boss treats you and that's capitalism. No, that's not capitalism. That's bourgeois right. Meaning, your boss sucks, you're exploited. That is not socialism. That will never get you to socialism, ever. Never. So let's just forget. I mean, I write about this in the book too, in my Horkheimer essay, where I just, Horkheimer wrote that, look, socialists didn't care about exploitation. They did not.
No, and I the only reason I want to focus on the question of what kind of work is actually reproducing capital by embodying commodities with abstract labor time, let's say it like that. The only reason that is an interesting question to me is because it points to what would need to be changed if we were to overcome capitalism, not because I am concerned about making sure people get fair wages.
No, I know. I think it's a strategic question.
Say what again?
A strategic question.
Yeah, it's strategic.
And I was just having this argument with Alex Grant, who's a former IMT member, on Trotskyism with the Swoletariat, with Eamon Stephen. And, we got into it. I was just like, look, Trotskyism is bunk because the Fourth International failed and the strategy is not good. And the Third International also failed and its strategy is not good. And so, it's basically, tweaking him a bit, saying we need to go back to the Second International. Not because we need to go back to the Second International, but because the Second International produced the possibility that then failed to be realized, and that's a deep question. But again, like strategy, there have been a lot of discussions around the DSA, for example, recent years about like, oh, maybe logistics is the way to go because strategically they're well placed to like stop the system, right? Like where can strikes happen to like, right? And it's like, wait.
Yeah.
We're not sure about any of those things. And so, but people are eager to be like, how can the workers change the system? We don't know. Like 2024, we've gotten very disconnected from that question, which doesn't mean we should give up on the working class or something. But we just don't have a concrete history of building up a movement in which you can say these workers are closer in a political sense to being able to seize the means of production. What are the means of production? Is it the server farms? Like, what are the means of production that need to be seized, really?
Yeah, I'm not even thinking of it on that level, like strategically. I agree with you that whenever some socialist talks about, well, the most important workers are the dock workers because they can stop things from coming into the country, or logistics, or whatever they might say, or if they start to complain, oh, we shouldn't organize baristas because they don't have enough power to matter and they can't stop the economy.
Right.
Like, yeah, well, that's not the point either. So that's one kind of question. But then I'm just saying, let's just pretend that we have the dictatorship of the proletariat. Then what would the task of the dictatorship of the proletariat be? And I am positing, and maybe this is Heideggerian of me or Zizekian of me, that part of what they would be trying to accomplish would be to create a basis for social cooperation that would be global and universal, that would not be based on their labor time. It would not be based on the freedom of labor, but on something else. And the way I conceive of this, and have for a long time, is Zizekian, although it's a perversion of Zizek, because he wouldn't think of it this way. But Zizek tells this joke about a man who went crazy and worried that he was a grain of corn and that a chicken would eat him. And so they sent him to a psychiatrist. He spent some time in the mental hospital, and the doctors worked with them, and he had a lot of psychoanalysis and therapy. And eventually he came to realize he was a human being, not a grain of corn. And they said, "Great, you can leave. Congratulations, you can leave the hospital." And he walked out into the courtyard and then turned right around and ran back in. And they said, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" He says, "There was a chicken out there." He says, "But you're not a grain of corn. You're a human being." He says, "Yes, I know that. But does the chicken know?" And so I feel as though we have a form of life now where we don't have to know what's guiding us, but there is some sort of objective ideology, objective truth that's operating for us, and that's where the knowledge actually is. And that if we were to try to overcome it, we may find that we would need a chicken that knew for us in order to cooperate socially. Does any of that make sense, or is that too?
That's a kind of a little bit of a distressed metaphor, but let's make sense of it. So it's what is capital? It's a negative phenomenon. It's a contradiction. At the same time, it's a contradiction that points beyond itself, right? So do we need to objectify capital in some way? Maybe, maybe not. Meaning, what we have to do is objectify the constraints that are entailed in the valorization process, the accumulation of capital, surplus value accumulation. And all that I was pointing to is that the question of surplus value accumulation, and therefore of capital accumulation, at a micro level, it can be illustrated with things like labor time. But at a macro level, one has to look at it historically and really see that it's the claim that the past is making on the future. That's what we're really talking about. And this is why Das Kapital is a difficult book, because it's like, why does Marx insist that workers are being paid not for the labor they've performed, but for future labor? And it's like, because that's the problem. Like, in other words, it's not like that is the case or isn't the case. It's because the problem is, how are we doing now? How is that constraining the future?
My understanding of the answer to that question, just the last one you raised, was it's because they're actually not being paid for the labor they perform, but rather for entering into a social contract where they will work. And their wage isn't equivalent to the work that they do, but the work that's been done by other workers to create the basket of commodities that they need to reproduce themselves. Yeah.
By the way, that is not Marx. That is Marx, but it's not Marx. It's Adam Smith.
Yeah.
And I feel like a lot of things would be cleared up if people would just read Adam Smith before they read Marx.
Probably, yeah.
And Adam Smith is very easy to understand and very straightforward. And he makes a point. Adam Smith says workers should be paid for their time, not for piecework. They shouldn't be paid for the goods that they produce, but rather for their time, for this very reason.
Mm-hmm.
Because he saw this as unleashing the potential of labor in the future. That paying them by time is paying them for the future, and that's what's going to drive the system on in a way to produce more wealth, lighten the load of labor. And he has no account of machines. Machines
right.
are tools like any other, so he doesn't have that problem. built into it, meaning that, okay, well, the workers are being paid for their time, but that time is being undermined by the fact that the machine will be more efficient in time than humans could ever be. And that human ingenuity in terms of efficiency of labor power will never keep pace with the improvement of machines.
I think that Marx would say that even when the workers are paid on a piecework basis, they
are being paid by their time.
Yeah.
That's Adam Smith too. So Adam Smith says it's an is and ought thing, to get back to philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
It's an is ought thing, which is, and it's dialectical. Smith is a dialectician. He's a Rousseauian. Mm-hmm. And by the way, both Kant and Hegel loved Adam Smith as a dialectician.
Mm-hmm.
So what is the dialectic? It's an is and ought dialectic, which is that the workers are paid for their time, and so they ought to be paid for their time. Mm-hmm. In other words, they're being paid for their time, but in such a way as to not realize the potential of being paid for their time. And that's why they ought to be paid for their time.
Right. And if they were paid for their time, directly, the idea would be that they would be more productive and free to
more leisure time. Mm-hmm. Right. And also, Adam Smith took for granted that workers would form labor unions, cooperate, and that all the improvements of production come through innovations that the workers themselves do collectively, not just individually, but collectively, like the pin factory. So basically, it's like the workers are thrown into the factory, and then they figure out the detailed division of labor to make the most efficient use of their time. It's not like the proprietor doesn't come in and say, you know what, it would be more productive if you guys did it in an assembly line. No, for Smith, the workers themselves figure it out because they want to work less and less, hard, less time and less intensely, and so they figure it out. And that's
right.
That's where we get the innovation and production from, because of course the proprietor doesn't care, at that point, because they're not a capitalist yet. Mm-hmm. Because they don't own capital, they don't own the means of production yet. Mm-hmm. Right? They only buy the goods that the workers produce. So they're just merchants. They're not yet capitalists.
Right. Yeah.
Right? And so that's where the whole thing, comes out then that, well, okay, then the issue is, what is capital as the property and the means of production? Which sounds very straightforward, but is actually not.
Right. No, it's not straightforward, because it is the way capital emerges when the freedom of labor turns against itself and is now embodied in these machines that do the dead labor becomes living labor in a not technically, but in a sense. Yeah, I agree.
So the workers now just need to come out on the other end of the process. In other words, if capital is alienated labor, then the workers need to seize that alienated labor politically. Mm-hmm. Right? So that's why they need to become the dictatorship of the proletariat. Because the workers at a global level need a kind of global view of production and the reproduction of the species and all the things that rich people, they may not even be capitalists. They might have cashed out. They might just be philanthropists. The people, what they're talking about at Davos, they're just like, oh, can we sustain this level of consumption and maybe degrowth and this population, and look at the climate and the earth, can it sustain this? It should be the workers doing that shit, not these rich people whose ideas may be more or less interesting. But the point of the matter is, these rich people, they're not in a position to change things. They're only in a position to sort of contemplate the unfolding catastrophe. Right? Mm-hmm. And to sort of wonder, oh, if the workers eat less hamburgers, maybe things.
And then they try to use the state and policies to nudge the workers in that direction, and the workers resist that.
And vote for Trump.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
For Christ's sake, I'm going to eat my hamburger. So, but anyway, because I don't care about methane emissions or whatever. Let capitalists are in charge. Let them figure that out. But
right. Anyway. I mean, one of the nice things about capitalism is supposed to be that those kinds of ethical concerns are put down to the individual level, or
the small group level.
or small group level, families and communities, let's
but
say.
professional organizations.
Okay, yeah.
Scientists.
But in the interest of the professional organizations, the individual workers, the families, the communities. I'll say again.
And of humanity, meaning people think about, like Kant's categorical imperative.
Mm-hmm.
It's not some utopian ideal. It's something that we're doing all the time.
Right.
Meaning we're always thinking, unless we're actual sociopaths, of which there are some, but we're always thinking, is this good for me? And what if everyone did it? Would that still be good for everyone? We're always doing that.
Yes, but somehow or another in this system, because we're alienated from our own power.
Absolutely.
More.
That doesn't work.
Doesn't work. So, okay, so I think we've come close to answering my objection, but I want to rephrase it. I kind of want to give you throw it to you in a softball way now. I gave you my best version of the objection. Here's my soft version of the objection. Very soft. Yesterday, Noah went for a walk and came back with a book. Because there are these little libraries that people have outside their house, like a little glass box, and said, take a book, leave a book. And so he took a book.
How Portland.
Yeah. It's very, very Portland. And you don't have that on the East Coast? You don't have these little...
In Chicago? Take a book. They have it in the laundry room in my building, which is a condo.
Yeah, okay. So similar, but not the same. So he took...
Republic.
And like, I forget the title, but the thrust of the book is something like what Adam Smith did wrong. And the book was about how Adam Smith undermined ethics and morality.
No. I'm here to say Adam Smith did nothing wrong.
Right.
Did absolutely nothing wrong.
But the point that they were making is because by driving economic development and creating economic man, Adam Smith undermined true values and morality.
Yeah. Right. Of course.
And I said, oh, that looks terrible. And he said, no, I think it's a religious book. And I said, oh, well, that'd be better if it's written from a Christian point of view, from some traditionalist point of view against Adam Smith.
Oh, as opposed to marginal utility theory or something, which I don't think.
Or as opposed to some leftist.
Leftists. Well, yeah. Right. That's why that's why I say the left is dead, because the left is actually the right. Meaning the left would be better off if they were just religious people, because that's really what they're expressing. All the objections to capitalism are basically better given by the religious people.
I totally agree, and if it was a book by the religious people, I'd be like, oh yeah, read that, Pete. Because then I would be confident that modernity and bourgeois values will win the day ultimately.
Maybe not. It's it's Max Weber. It's a theodicy, meaning it's like Adam Smith is a theological problem, but a theological problem in the negative sense of Adam Smith. What Adam Smith advocated, he may not have intended it, but gave us this godless and therefore inhuman world. And maybe he did intend it, because I think he was an atheist. Him and Hume, I think, were atheists together. And that David Hume refused last rites on his deathbed.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and then Adam Smith was one of the partisans of protecting Hume's legacy and not falsifying it by making it seem like David Hume actually was a devout Christian.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, no, he definitely was not. He's an atheist, which was very controversial in that time.
So my question is that, do you think that my concern about the need to replace labor time ultimately can be cashed out as a romantic striving after a
new religion?
Yeah.
A new religion, Doug. New religion. You're also on the West Coast. That's where all the cults come from.
Right. So, I mean,
including the socialist movement. The socialist movement for this reason. So we don't have a picture of the future. We don't. Not at all. And we can't. So what do we have? We have a picture of the present, and we have a contradictory picture of the present, which is that the working class is both the problem and the solution. So like, look, I mean, the Democrats have done us a favor of demonizing the working class. Because they really have demonized the working class. Because win or lose, Trump's going to get more minority voters, and they're just going to be dismissed as part of the deplorables. You talk about the basket of commodities, the basket of deplorables, right? You might as well throw them in the same basket, right? They're only good for the consumption of capital, and if they are too ornery, you got to beat them back down into that basket, right? So, AOC. Like, it's selfish to have children. She didn't mean rich people. She meant everybody. Right? And, I mean, of course, if I confronted her with it, she'd be like, oh, no, that's not what I meant. And it's like, yes, it is what you meant, and you might as well recognize it. It's natural in this society for us to think the problem is overpopulation. If you ask your average person, what's the problem with the world? Instinctively, they're going to say too many people.
Yeah, only now figures like Elon Musk and J.D. Vance are saying the opposite.
Well, because they figured out that actually, right, if the reproduction of the human race stops, it will bring an end to capitalism too. In other words, they understand the system actually depends on population growth, and so it's like they have a funny, like, oblique recognition, that economic growth depends on population growth, which is another one of these sort of cause and effect reversals that you see in capitalism. Meaning, why does capital have to grow? Capital has to grow in order to account for population growth.
Right.
Well, why does the population have to grow in order to keep capital going? It's like, what? Okay. Like, again, like, you can see these things for what they are, but only, I guess, after you've become a Marxist monk like me.
Speaking of the new religion,
right? Well, not a kind of a religion without God. It's like Buddhism or something, meaning only if you've attained the plane of existence, like the galactic brain or whatever the meme is. No. In other words, where you've had time to turn these ideas over in your head enough iteration, realize, oh, actually, this shows up in all sorts of different ways.
Right.
The contradiction shows up.
My understanding is capitalism sometimes requires the population to increase and sometimes requires it to decline. It's not that it always just wants to increase the population, or that that's always
what the time interval is. Meaning,
the trend is up, but it goes back. Yeah. Okay.
The trend is up, which makes the climate people freak out because they're like, how, in 2050 we're going to have 20 billion people. The Earth can't sustain that. Yeah, maybe it can, maybe it can't. Meaning, to my mind, that confuses the qualitative and the quantitative. Meaning, maybe, like, you can't sustain 10 or 20 billion people on the consumption patterns of metropolitan workers. Maybe not. So maybe a future beyond capitalism will be a different kind of consumption. Maybe it will be a lower population. I mean, we just don't know. Like,
I like to envision that we'll put a what is it called, a Dyson sphere around the sun, and
but that's pure quantitative, right? In other words, that we just colonize the cosmos. That's cool too. I have a feeling that's going to be a little bit miserable. I don't know whether we're going to be able to put people in freezers to go for millennia across this interstellar space. I don't know. Maybe. I mean, it's dystopian. It's utopian. It's dystopian.
Yeah, it's both. Yeah, which
right?
is and you can see that in the history of science fiction writing. In the 30s, 40s, and 50s, it was utopian. In the 60s and 70s, the same kinds of stories would be all about like being this feelings of being trapped, being controlled by a bureaucracy, of turning inward on yourself and going partially insane. And some of my favorite writers, like Barry Malzberg, wrote about astronauts going insane.
Yes.
During space travel.
I feel sad for the people stranded on the space station because the Boeing Starliner sucks. So not only the Boeing airliners suck, but the Boeing Starliner sucks. And so then now they have to be rescued by SpaceX. But NASA won't let them send a SpaceX capsule before February. And it's like, fuck. And you know that Elon Musk is ready to go. He's just like, I will rescue the astronauts tomorrow. Yeah. And they just let him. Right?
Right. Why are they delaying it till February?
Oh, because they need to make sure of this, that, and the other thing. And also they're trying to piggyback it off another mission that's already scheduled. So, I mean, there are reasons.
Also, they don't want Elon Musk to have a big victory before the election.
Probably not. Probably not. That's probably no. I'm sure that's some kind of a strange unconscious factor in it involved. But yeah. I mean, just orbital travel is this whole very complex calculation about when a launch can happen and when it can't happen in order to put things into a certain orbit. There are windows. There are launch windows, and they don't come all the time. So, but I just thought those people who expected to spend less than 2 weeks are now spending more than 6 months. And I read an article about how these astronauts train their whole lives to be in space, so they're just happy to be in space for as long as possible. And I'm like, I'm not sure about that.
No.
I'm not sure about that.
No, because it's not good for your body.
Physically, it's not good. I mean, people do stay for longer than that. So there are, but they weren't prepared for that. Also, if you look at them, they're middle-aged people. They're not young people. The two astronauts the guy's a little chunky, and it's it's one thing to send up a 30-year-old for a long term, because they calculate these things. So I'm just like, oh shit, that sounds like a hell.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you, I'm still on the same theme here. I'm kind of working this out in my head. I had a paranoid thought about you recently, which was that, there back in the day, some email leaked, and it's like, our goal is to get rid of all the other Marxists and be the only Marxists left. And then I thought about that, and I thought about how you, when we were at the DNC, we're talking about how all these leftist groups always want to read Das Kapital. It's the same book, it's Das Kapital, Volume 1, again and again and again, and that is such an impediment to actual politics, I think is what you said. And which, coming out of the milieu I did, made me think. I think I understand your reasoning for that, and perhaps your reasoning
for that. I'm not hostile to reading Das Kapital at all. I think Derek Varn accused me of this. And it's like, no, that's not really the point. The point is, I've been around long enough, and also I've read histories of the New Left. And I've even read things from the 1930s, from the Frankfurt School, from the Trotskyist milieu, from the Stalinist milieu. And guess what? Whenever the left is at an impasse, people start two kinds of reading groups. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, motherfuck. And then Capital. Marxist.
Which I did, and that's what I did. I read the phenomenology.
To me, it's funny, right? Because I do think actually you'd be better off with the science of logic and the philosophy of right, actually, because the phenomenology of spirit is really about the emergence of bourgeois subjectivity. And then it's confused. Like I said, the master-slave dialectic. People think that it's a battle to the death. It's like life and death, and it's like no.
I don't understand how anyone can make that mistake. I mean, having read the phenomenology.
Because these kids don't know what labor is, Doug. They've never had a job. And so they're just like, my parents want to kill me. They're stuck in some pre-Oedipal drama of maternal, paternal annihilation or something. And I swear to God, it's that. It's like master-slave dialectic. It's like fucking Kojev and some bullshit. And I'm like, oh no.
But even Kojev didn't think that it was all about this.
He knew his labor.
Yeah, right.
No, it's some Sartreanism. It's also Heidegger, the being unto death. And, because of course Heidegger objected to the idea that self-consciousness only comes from labor. But no, it comes from finitude. It comes from death. Right?
Right. Oh, yeah.
And that labor metaphysics denies death. And Adorno's response to that was, hell yes, it denies death.
Right.
In other words, we're members of society. We are contributing to hopefully the immortality of the human species and of society and history in an emancipatory direction, progress and consciousness of freedom. Right? We are defying death, freedom.
Right. And so this is what I wanted to say. Like, well, I want to say two things. One is, when I think about your critique of people reading Das Kapital, and badly, I think is really what you're worried about, or at the wrong time, or without having enough understanding to get at the text. I also remind myself that Guy Debord claimed that Marx's trip to the British Library and writing of Capital signified the defeat of right, and that it was part of how, for him, that you could arrive at a Bolshevism that was statist and trapped within the capitalist economy, trapped reproducing it.
It's a Korsch idea. Karl Korsch has this idea, which I write about in my book as well, which is that he's sort of deeply ambivalent. Ultimately, he comes to be ambivalent about Marxism. So he starts out as someone trying to figure out like the Marx-Lenin through line, the Marx-Luxemburg-Lenin through line. And then he becomes disenchanted with Marxism. And what he observes is that Marx and Engels were only connected to the class struggle in 1848, and then only briefly around the First International and the Paris Commune, but really consistently they were increasingly divorced from the class struggle. And that therefore Das Kapital was like this perfected theoretical system that could only be reimposed on the living workers' movement to bad effect. And he thought the Second International did that, and now the Third International was doing the same. That basically it was reifying the working class through a perfected theory of capitalism produced by Marx when Marx was divorced from the workers' actual living struggle. And that's what he said. Ultimately, we have to say Marxism made its contribution, but we should also include anarchism, et cetera, and Bernstein. Like, he basically came to the point of like, the workers need it all. And by the way, I think there's a kernel of truth to that. Meaning, in some ways, the Campaign for a Socialist Party is true to that idea, but without this like tortured ambivalence about Marxism. Right. Without having to say, oh, well, this is where Marx went wrong, or this is the Second International and Leninist mistake. Right. No, we need it all, meaning we need it all. And, meaning we need not to taboo it or hive off things. We have to reproduce what Marxism was motivated by, which was a very diverse workers' movement for socialism. Right. And we should also understand why so much of what the so-called socialists do is not only off-putting to working people, but really counter to their interests, I think. Oh, because it narrows them too much. Right, like the we can talk about the debate between Trump and Kamala in the second half, but but to draw something out of that, when asked about their policies, one thing that emerged through that debate was Kamala was always talking about what the state could do for people, and contrary to that, what Trump talked about was how he had created conditions in the economy where people could be more free and employed. Jobs. Right. Now, most people on the left and even on the right, I think, would look at what Trump has been saying this time around as being a affirmation or reaffirmation of neoliberalism. Tax cuts, deregulation, policy-wise. But the goal is different. Yeah, the aim is politically different. And I recently visited my parents, and I had a conversation with my father about Democrats and Republicans. And he says, I don't understand why it is that everyone believes that the Republicans are better for the economy, because if you look at the data, the economy's consistently been better under Democrats again and again and again, the majority of the time. And I said, well, I think it depends on where you are in the economy as to what. It's a little bit of an FDR, even though I know he's not that old, but I kind of feel like the Republicans have been saddled since FDR with the myth that their free marketism has been bad for the economy, actually. Right? So it's like Hooverville.
Right. Yeah.
Like that kind of thing. And then it seems to make sense because actually we've had very few Republican presidents. Meaning, the downturn hit during Nixon. There was some kind of a recession in the 50s that JFK came in to give tax cuts to alleviate. Like, in other words, Eisenhower. And then Reagan came in, but really after the economic crisis. And then his first few years were rough, but then he actually did turn it around. And then George W. Bush got the dot-com bubble, the 9/11 recession, and then ultimately seemingly teed up the Great Recession.
Yeah, but all of that could be connected to Clintonism as well as to
That's
Bush,
why,
right?
it can look like, the easiest way of thinking about it would be Clinton benefited from the Reagan Revolution. That the
Right.
90s were the fulfillment.
Yeah, right. You could make the argument at
Tony
both
Blair
directions. If you want to blame Clinton for the 2008 crisis, you can just as easily blame Reagan as well.
Sure.
Right.
Yep.
So, yeah. So what I thought was, well, the thing is, from a small business perspective, and maybe even from the perspective of a worker, you are more attracted to the promises of economic growth and recovery and a free market approach that the Republicans put forward than you are by the technocratic welfare state approach of the Democrats. Because the Democrats are promising you, even though you can't work, you will get a wage. Somehow. And the Republicans are saying, we're going to make it so that you can work the way you want to and be free to participate in society. And the state isn't going to get in your way of that. That's
right.
the Republican.
And, they chalk it up to other things, which again we can talk about in the second half, like interest rates. And this goes back to the capital S subject and the small s subject, right? Which is the Volcker shock, Powell's raising of the interest rates. I mean, Marxists used to understand this. I don't know if people can face it squarely. Raising interest rates kills people. That's why it's done. It's done to create unemployment. It's done to cut wages. It kills people. And so, if we have to hear about how, like, the Dodd decision overturning Roe versus Wade is killing people, well, the interest rate's going to kill a lot more people than that, actually. A lot more people than that. And not only in the United States. Right? And it's done deliberately. They know. But it's just the price that has to be paid. It's not like they don't know. They do know. And so how do you package that? You have to package it as, we respect the dignity of people of all races, genders, blah, blah, blah. We respect them even as we demand their sacrifice.
Even as they're sent down into the dustbin of history or into their graves.
Yeah, and they should go, they should go without trouble. Don't do riots. Don't vote for Trump. Don't do January 6th, Be good Christians, accept your lot.
Right. I mean, the flip side of that is the Republicans saying, well, the market should work, and if it isn't working for you,
they're varieties of the same thing.
Yeah, right.
There are varieties of the same thing. But look, in terms of blaming who for what, it's like, the Democrats have lived under this. I mean, I always thought that Trump dodged a bullet by being unelected in 2020.
And then he dodged a bullet for real.
Yeah, and they dodged a bullet for real. Meaning that there was going to be an inflation to catch up with the Great Recession. There was going to be inflation coming out of COVID. There was going to be all this turbulence that Biden necessarily inherited. And so it's convenient for Trump to avoid responsibility for that. Not that it was his fault, right? Like, it's actually built into how the Great Recession was resolved, right? They tried to keep the economy on fumes, on low interest rates for a long time. They just deferred it, and it caught up. It inevitably caught up. And there's a lot built into this. Like, look, the Great Recession destroyed the middle class around the world, and that's where the migration crisis comes from.
Mm-hmm.
Right, all this stuff. I mean, the U.S., is absorbing the middle class of Latin America and beyond, and that is condemning those countries to complete devastating poverty and collapse.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, you take in the middle class, and then you build that wall. Kamala is building the wall because they know, right, that this is going to collapse these states.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they know. They definitely know. And the problem is that the left doesn't know. The left builds everything off the press releases of the people who know and don't tell. And so Trump's mistake is that he comes out and he peels back the curtain and he's like, well, right? And then they're like, no, you're not supposed to say that.
Right.
Right? You're not supposed to open that can of worms because we can't do anything about it, so don't mention it.
Right. And, part of the reason why I think I want to find God, or to put it cruelly towards myself, or to put it differently, want to be able to say, if we were to overcome this form of freedom, another form of social cooperation and freedom would be there. We can be confident ahead of time that it will be there. Is precisely because I want to peel back, open that can of worms, peel back the curtain, and make this system face itself, but I, without the confidence of knowing that there's at least a semblance of another way of relating, it feels almost a little irresponsible.
We already do have it, meaning we have this engine of development, abstract labor. It's powerful. Mm-hmm. And again, it was emancipatory, and then it became simultaneously emancipatory and dominating. And at a concrete level, we're generating things all the time that suggest a post-capitalist future, but only in a very constrained and distorted form, only in a very kind of abortive and stunted way. But it's not like we'll be inventing something out of whole cloth. We will be building socialism out of capitalism, at a concrete level, not only at an abstract level. But a lot of this needs to be figured out in the process because we don't know exactly concretely who the agents of revolution are going to be. In other words, if we say, well, only the workers can change it, that's still a very abstract proposition. And again, what we mentioned earlier, well, who is the working class? So in my debate with Alex Grant on the Swoletariat, one of the comments was, can Chris Cutrone please explain who he thinks the working class is? And I was like, hell if I know. Meaning it's not just an objective category. It's a subjective category. Meaning the working class has to constitute itself in its struggle against socialism. And then it will include, right? And it will encourage people to see themselves as workers.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
In a way that now it's like, oh, who's a worker and who's not a worker? Fuck. That's just, no. Totally backwards. First we have to figure out who's really a worker. No, we don't, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Start with a socialist movement. We don't have to start with a Labor Party and then figuring out, well, who gets to join the Labor Party? Who's what's a legitimate labor union versus what's an illegitimate labor union? Right? Is a cop union a legitimate labor union or not?
Mm.
Right? That was something that afflicted the DSA early on.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, not because cops aren't workers. They are workers. They're exploited wage workers. They are. However, they also occupy a role in society that might create a conflict of interest in terms of participating as such in the socialist movement. Meaning maybe cop unions can't be part of the socialist movement, but they are part of the labor movement, and there's a difference between those two things. And maybe individual cops can be socialists, but cops as a collective political body can't be, because their job is to protect the capitalist state, right? So we have to navigate that stuff. There's no easy, clean answer, and the past doesn't give it to us clean either. Because we could say, okay, the old communists said this and that, and it's like, yeah, under certain conditions, in a strategic and tactical way, that we have to find for ourselves now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. All right, listen, we've done this for an hour. Let's end it here. Thank you, and people can join us in the second half to hear us, our analysis of the debate. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.